In this edition of the Armchair Philosopher, I'm going to talk about Jean Baudrillard, the late French postmodern philosopher of India. Pretty influential guy, even if not terribly well known by name. His book, Simulacra and Simulation, is actually the inspiration for the Matrix movies. In fact, in the first Matrix movie, at one point you can see in the background on a bookshelf that book is sitting there. Pretty influential, also been adapted pretty widely in various social theory and in theological studies and biblical studies. And I want to talk about specifically just the general idea of what he's trying to get at with what is the simulacra and simulation. In order to do that, it's worth talking about his orders of knowing, or his orders of engagement with reality. So the first order that he's talking about is the basic order of encounter. This basic order of encounter doesn't necessarily know truth or falseness. It's a statement just of the basic nature of reality as we encounter it. So if you might think about an apple, if we can go to a diagram of Immanuel Kant, an apple is not necessarily true or false. An apple just is an apple. And so if you think about Immanuel Kant and the way that he understood the noumena, the thing as it is, unconditioned reality, that would be that first order reality. It's the thing that we encounter. And that thing that we encounter becomes the thing that we begin to then organize into structures of meaning. And once we begin to organize them into structures of meaning, they begin to take on truth value or false value. So an apple isn't necessarily true, but once you begin to organize it into, for instance, a categorization of what might be preferential, you can begin to think about what truthfully is a good apple or a bad apple. Otherwise, you don't know what it is, you just have what we think of as an apple. In theological studies, one can look to the work of Hans Frey, which is pretty significant here, where he's wanting to talk about the nature of theological reflection begins ultimately with the biblical narrative. So if you think of the biblical narrative beginning with this claim of God speaks, this is my crude way of trying to describe speech, this breath coming from the mouth, and the narrative unfolds in a way in which you then have a fall at some point, and then lots of things happen. Right? You can think about the Red Sea, and you can think of the Sea of Reeds more properly, and Mount Sinai, say it's snow-capped, and eventually you get to the cross. The cross is that seminal moment for Christian readings of Scripture, and that creates this entity that we think of as the church that ultimately culminates in the return of Christ. And don't think in terms of scale here, I'm not going for that. But this is itself that thing that we encounter. Well, the biblical narrative itself doesn't actually contain within it any sorts of claims about what it means for Jesus to be God and the Father to be God and the Spirit to be God. There's no doctrine of the Trinity within the text, the narrative of the text itself. The doctrine of the Trinity rather belongs to what we might think of as second-order discourse. So doctrine takes place here. Doctrine specifically would be maybe those propositional claims that are attempting to get at this thing right here and make certain kinds of judgments about it. So even if the Bible, for instance, the biblical narrative, comes to us in the form of narrative and Psalms and Proverbs and various reactions with characteristics and characters within that narrative, a judgment that Christians want to make about the biblical narrative is that it presents to us a God who is intrinsically one, and yet at the same time as being one, three persons, three ways of being God, who are all distinct in their personhood and their willful locations, and yet act fully in accord with each other as one being, indistinguishable, right? And yet in another sense, distinguishable as persons. Confusing in some senses, but there's a lot of history of interpretation that goes into that. That's a doctrine, it's a judgment. Or, for instance, the doctrine of salvation by faith alone, that is big for the Reformation. Salvation by faith alone in Christ alone, as administered and worked out in people's hearts and lives by the Spirit alone. That's a judgment being said about this narrative. And that's second order. So second order is where you can begin to have discussions of truthness and falseness. True and false. And so doctrine might give way to conversations on orthodox versus heretical. Right? Here, what theologians are saying is that if it's doctrine that correctly or fairly or accurately makes sense of the judgments of the text, then it is an orthodox doctrine. If it does not accurately do that, if it takes away from the narrative, if it undermines the ability to understand the fullness of the narrative in a meaningful way, then it becomes a heretical judgment. It's meaning to impose some outside sort of categories of control and structure upon the narrative. That's what's meant by heretical. What else belongs here? Theology. Some think of theology as identical with doctrine. Some people do mean this, but others see theology as an active engagement. Right? Doctrine is a judgment about the text. Theology is an encounter with the text from a particular place. So we do theology right here, and in a distinct way than we might do theology from Nairobi, Kenya, or from New Delhi, India, or from Shanghai, for instance. The idea of doing theology is now about the ability to encounter it from particular sets of experiences, and we can return to this philosophically to Immanuel Kant, what he's trying to do here. What he's saying is that as you begin to enter into the phenomenal realm is that encounter that we have. We don't get it reality as we know it, or as it actually is. We have reality as we know it. It's the sensible essence, or the nominal essence. That sensible or nominal essence that we encounter is itself a procession from the real essence, the thing as it is, as John Locke would talk about it, but it proceeds for Kant through these categories. Now, you don't have to work in terms of Kant's 12 categories or his precise working, but understand then that the judgments that we arrive at for Kant are themselves second order. They're a step removed from reality. They're conditioned reality. And you can make claims about the truthfulness about the judgments or the falseness of the judgments. This is important for Baudrillard because he's now wanting to set up distinctions. Right? There's reality as it might be, but we never know reality in a purely first order way. We encounter reality through second order ways. So my declaration of doctrine and theology was a way of describing a couple ways that works out. Right? Philosophically, you can just think in terms of concepts. Concepts would be second order because they are themselves the ways in which we take judgments and we appropriate them through what's the everyday normal of our lives, right? This is the realm, in some sense, of the imaginative. The imaginative is the taking of what encounters, or what we encounter, what makes an appearing to us, and it's a taking of that, and it's a projecting of a reality from that, second order. Now, the third order is a place where we come out the other end. So if the first order is not able to be true or false, and the second order is where truthness and falseness is, the third order is the other end of that, where things that are true and things that are false are now irrelevant categories or descriptions. Now, what does Baudrillard mean by that? What he means here is that we no longer have a concern for what's true and false. We have mechanisms for ordering the world that overlay upon the world in a way that give you systems. Systems specifically of power, control, right? So what might one of these be? Well, think about the ways in which we encounter advertisements. You can walk down the streets and you can encounter an advertisement for perfume on a bus stop. Now, that advertisement for perfume doesn't want you to encounter it as a thing in and of itself. It doesn't want you to just go up to it and say, well, perfume is selling me a smell, so I should go up to this ad and I should smell it. In fact, smelling a perfume ad on a city bus stop is going to be a really unpleasant experience. It's counterproductive to what the advertisers want you to do. So instead, it's a long process of conditioning. This long process of conditioning gets you into a particular mode where now you're not thinking in terms of perfume smell, you're thinking in terms of some larger category of what it means to be beautiful, right? An image of beauty that has been projected upon you and formed you from a young age, such that you have expectations of beauty. And now you think, oh, wow, Natalie Portman, she's beautiful. And if she's beautiful and she's wearing this perfume, then I can get this perfume for myself, or for my significant other, or for a friend, or for a child. And now that will project a notion of beauty upon this other person. right? But the key here is that you're selling a smell, but you're selling it through sight. And the way that you do that is through this sort of smoke screen in which you're trying to connect the two through this other image that really has nothing to do necessarily with the smell, right? Smells in and of themselves as first orders are not only neither true nor false, they're neither necessarily pleasant or unpleasant. Now we might think, of course, I don't like certain smells like a skunk, but Baudrillard would see these things as conditioned realities, right? We understand the pleasantness and unpleasantness in terms of the normativity of what we prefer. Think, for instance, about tastes. Maybe this is easier to go with. If you go to the World of Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, the final act of this museum is a giant room where you get to encounter many flavors of Coca-Cola from around the world. But here's the thing. As you encounter these other flavors, and they're classified within the geographic locations in which they're found, Western observers or Western tasters tend to go into these other settings, and maybe they encounter a flavor that's common in China. And it's not uncommon to go to those flavors and say, oh, that's gross. But on the other hand, people in China evidently like it. Why do they like it? Well, they're conditioned in their tastes according to certain senses of normalcy. And it's this certain sense of normalcy that Jean Baudrillard is wanting to get at. That's the third order thing that, in fact, what we think of as true or false is not the state that the taste is actually true or false at all, any more than the smell is true or false for the perfume head. It's that we've entered and engaged a world that's been shaped for us precisely as a means to control us. In the case of Coca-Cola, or in the case of perfume, the desire is to get us to buy. Buy not because there's some intrinsic value in buying, but because buying enables the producers to make money, right? It makes them rich. So we become pawns within a system, and the goal is therefore to incorporate us into it, so that we're not necessarily thinking about truthness or falseness, but we're thinking now in terms of the ability to be able to enjoy this thing within a construct of what it means to live well in the world. But there's nothing inherently right or wrong about that living world except for what's commended to us, right? Now, truth or false things can enter into here, but they're an appearance of truthness or falseness. So you might think of a power construction within which you've been compelled to believe that something is true, but it's not necessarily true at all. It's just a way of controlling you. Now, this last one might be a bit controversial, but I'll throw it out there anyway. For instance, for the last many decades, the political movement known as the religious right, or the moral majority, has put forth a narrative in which the primary and only issue that from the very beginning is important, and it's important for evangelical Christians to be formed into, is abortion. Now, there may be good reasons, in fact, for that to be a major concern, but the reality is when you look at the history, Roe v. Wade was never actually an issue in the first decade, or most of the first decade, for galvanizing the evangelical movement politically. In fact, most evangelical groups saw this as a Catholic issue, and when Roe v. Wade was made, or was pronounced as giving the right to abortion, saw this as a good thing because it enables women to have choice, it enables nuance to be declared in terms of the reasons people might have abortions. It wasn't really a thing, but what was a galvanizing thing was a decision that was made by the IRS to begin to remove tax exemption from Christian institutions for continuing to segregate, even though that had been against the law now for over 20 years. This made Christians upset, and they began to galvanize around that. Well, the problem is you can't galvanize in a post-civil rights era explicitly around a racial matter. So what did the leaders of this movement do? They began to refocus around not race per se, but religious rights. And religious rights then began to be a way in which they began to speak of the formation of a community that was being assaulted by the government, which was destroying, therefore, the family. And that entered then people, and this is a truncated narrative, but it entered people then into a statement of, therefore, we need to care about specifically family values and especially abortion. Again, I'm not making a comment about whether or not that should be cared about, and I'm not making a comment about whether evangelicals today really do care about the issue. I think that is obvious.